The broadcast is now starting. All attendees.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar on how to implement an information security management system. I'm Alan Calder. I'm the Chief Executive and Executive Chairman of IT Governance in the UK and in the US, and I'm going to be your host this afternoon. My background is in general business management. I'm not a lawyer or technician or information security person, but I got involved in the field of information security and cyber compliance some 20 years ago when I wrote a book about how organizations should address implementing information security. It was called IT Governance, which is how the company itself got its name, and it was focused on the board's involvement in information security, and it talked about the forerunner to what is now ISO 27001. I thought then that it was the backbone of any effective information security management system. The book has gone on to be the Open University postgraduate textbook. It's now in its 6th edition, and the business has gone on to grow quite substantially. We have a business in the UK. We have a business in the US, IT Governance USA Inc. It's a Delaware incorporated business with a website in the US. We've just opened. We've got an office in New York, and we are delivering services across the broad range of things that we deal with in the US as well as everywhere else in the world. So in the general field of governance, risk management and compliance, most of our activity tends to be on the cyber resilience side of data protection compliance, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, both very big areas for us right now. Those, of course, are very closely tied into the ideas of cybersecurity and the International Information Security Standard, ISO IEC 27001. And all of those then also enmeshed with standards like PCI DSS, with the business continuity standard, with penetration testing and the Cyber Essentials frameworks. And we deliver all of that through a range of services, from consultancy and certification through technical security, training and qualifications. We have a software business, and of course, books and toolkits, and all of that can be accessed through itgovernanceusa.com, our website. You will have noticed that you're all on mute, and I'll be talking for about 40 or 45 minutes as I talk through the ISO 27001 approach to information security. Please, if you find you have questions, do use the question function in the GoToWebinar panel, which should be somewhere on your screen, probably on the right-hand side. If you click on it, you can type questions into it as they occur to you, and then when we come to the Q&A session, what I'll do is I'll pick questions in the order that you've posed them, and I'll share the question with the audience, and then I'll provide the answer. So please do, as a question strikes you, use the question function to make sure that you get to have me answer it. So today's webinar is going to be about the risk-based approach to information security, which is at the heart of ISO 27001. The core concept is that controls that you put in place inside an organization should be appropriate to the risks and to the risk appetite of the organization, rather than just put in as a required set of controls. We'll talk a bit about organization-wide commitment. Increasingly, effective cybersecurity does depend not just on technical controls, but on people and process controls, and so we'll talk a bit about how those intersect and the importance of the controls that you put in place to deal with that. We'll look briefly at the 9-step approach to implementing an ISMS. That's an approach which got its own book, which was first published a number of years ago, the 9 Steps to Success, and we'll go through the 9 steps to implementing an information security management system. Talk a bit about why ISO 27001 is increasingly seen as the global standard for information security and cybersecurity around the world, the role of risk assessments in helping you choose and select controls, how to test an ISMS, the way to go about developing documentation, and then the benefits of obtaining independent assurance, both in terms of giving assurance to the board, but also, more importantly, giving assurance to customers and to regulators. And at the end of all of that, as I said, there'll be a question and answer session. All in all, we have about an hour at our disposal this evening. So, as I said, about 45 minutes of me talking, and then a short period of questions and answers that you've got that you want me to address. So our first section is talking about how to go about adopting a comprehensive risk-based approach to information security. And a sensible way to start that conversation really is with a discussion of what an ISMS is. What is an information security management system? Well, the most standard definition is the one that you see in the second bullet point on your screen. It's a documented, systematic approach which relies on people, processes, and technology, and which is designed to help manage, monitor, audit, and improve an organization's information security. So it's a management system for driving improvements in information security. And if your organization is concerned about how it demonstrates that it's meeting a whole range of compliance requirements in respect of information security, an ISMS is a very practical way to go about doing it. It helps manage all security practices consistently, cost effectively, and in one joined up framework. And as I said, it can help you meet the whole range of obligations from NYDFS through EU GDPR, through data breach reporting requirements, to HIPAA, to GLBA. They can all be addressed in a single framework which is built on an international standard, and therefore brings assurance that you can use with any of the entities that need to know that what you're doing is appropriate. So the three pillars of cybersecurity really are people, process, and technology. Many organizations have been led over the years to believe that effective information security is achieved simply by deploying the latest in the form of anti-malware software, leak detection software, access control software, a whole range of software solutions, all in a secure physical and digital environment. And the truth is that technology on its own is simply software and hardware. It's bits and bytes sitting in boxes, and it really only does something useful if you've got people and process, people who can configure it appropriately, and processes that set out how that technology should be configured. But of course, the people and process bits are much more than just the means to effective configuration of hardware and software. People and process are themselves attack vectors. So you need to deal with all of the weaknesses there are in and around staff through areas like staff training and awareness, through ensuring people have appropriate skills and accreditations, and then of course you've got adequate resource inside the business. You want people working to documented procedures within well-constructed governance frameworks that reflect best practice and which enable management to carry out audits, to give management assurance that things are being done properly, but also to enable regulators, customers, and third-party certification bodies to carry out audits, because it's those things which enable you as an organization to demonstrate that you are genuinely compliant and secure. So why would you use ISO 27001 to achieve those objectives? Well, firstly, it's the only international standard there is for information security, and you may already know of standards like ISO 9001, which has existed since the late 1970s, early 1980s. It's a standard for quality in management processes inside primarily service organizations. It's gone on to be used in manufacturing organizations and many others, but it's dealing with process quality. In other words, how an organization goes about ensuring that what it's doing, it does consistently and on a continual improvement basis. ISO 27001 takes the same concept and applies that to information security, and recognizes that organizations have assets that need to be protected, and that different organizations may choose to protect those assets differently. And it provides a specification for how an organization can do that. The certifications to the standard is now one of the fastest growing areas of certification in the world, growing at an annual rate of about 20%. At its current growth rate, which is likely to fluctuate up over the next few years, there will be something like 500,000 certified organizations around the world within the next 7 or so years. And then it becomes even more pervasive, because organizations with ISO 27001 increasingly look to see that those organizations with whom they have digital connections are themselves appropriately secure, and look to ISO 27001 as a means to demonstrate that. So ISO 27001, an accredited certification, in other words, certification carried out by a certification body that is constituted within the framework of a national accreditation body, is the most effective and most widely recognized way in which to go about getting your management system recognized. So ISO 27001 is a mechanism for getting a best practice information security management system in place that can be audited by any third party, which can give a competitive advantage, because it can demonstrate that in ways that customers aren't. You're looking after personal data, but not only are you looking after personal and corporate data, you're also doing so in an environment that's secure, and therefore for your customers, you're unlikely to be an attack vector. And you think of some of the major attacks that have taken place over the years, and it's often been through an insecure supply chain partner that the attack has been launched. So you can look at information security and demonstrable information security as an effective means for winning a competitive edge in your marketplace. So implementing an ISMS does take more than just the CISO saying, let's do this. It's going to affect every part of the organization, and to one extent or another, it's a significant change project. So getting organization-wide commitment to information security is fairly important. And it's important because, of course, everybody has a role to play in information security. Everybody is dealing in data, even if it's just customer names or staff names. It might be more significant. It might be highly confidential information. It might be personally identifiable information. It could be top secret information, depending on the organization. So everybody's dealing with information. Everybody has the opportunity to download malware, to install ransomware by mistake, and therefore you need to get everybody involved in information security. And that means that you need top management commitment, senior leadership commitment. It's a bit of a truism that in those organizations where top management thinks that information security does not apply to them, most of the staff tend to take the same kind of view. Where top management are signed up to the program, they lead by example, they make sure that security is carried out effectively. That tends to work from the top down through the organization. It also tends to mean that management will provide the necessary budget and resources so that the implementation team can implement the ISMS, and more importantly, so that the ISMS can be maintained thereafter. Quite often, organizations forget the people factor. As I've said, the people factor is a pretty critical part of what you're doing. It's one of the 3 key components of an ISMS, and staff awareness training, therefore, is fundamental to how you do that. But of course, staff awareness training doesn't need to be at the same level of depth as does the CISO training or the IT manager or a business continuity manager. They need to have significantly greater level of training. So you want to be looking at staff awareness training to operate at a level which ensures they're aware of a wide range of things at a relatively cursory level, but also so they've got very specific knowledge about areas like what does a phishing email look like, how not to join one. If you watched Homeland, you would have seen the protagonist download a hairy bit of malware, of ransomware, by clicking on a link in what might have been an innocuous email. But making sure staff understand that kind of stuff, using engaging training tools, thought-provoking activities. Make sure staff are not only aware of the daily cyber risks they face, but enable them to understand how they can go about minimizing the risks, what to do when presented with an opportunity to cause a breach. Securing top management commitment is not easy. According to the most recent Global Status of Information Security survey, only 28% of UK boards are actually involved in setting security strategy. And if you're not involved in setting strategy, that probably means you're not involved at all. And if the board is not involved in security in just under 3/4 of our companies, that kind of means that security is going to be fairly weak. One of the benefits to a board of an information security management system is it gives the board better overview of what's going on in terms of security, of how well it's working. An ISMS should drive effective reporting in terms of how information security is helping the organization achieve its objectives. And it should demonstrate that cybersecurity is an ongoing process. An effective ISMS should help an organization avoid issues before they arise. If you're able to track emerging vulnerabilities, if you're able to see emerging threats, you can take avoiding action across the organization way before it turns into a problem. Sometimes way before, of course, might be a matter of hours, but before is still the right thing to be doing. So it's an ongoing process. And regular communication between management and the board on cybersecurity is a critical part of enabling management to demonstrate that it's accountable for implementing an information security strategy, and that it's able to put the board in a position where it can reflect on its accountability for there being a strategy, and for ensuring the strategy evolves and demonstrates evolution in the face of changing business requirements. The key discussions at board level should be about the basis on which the organization should be avoiding, accepting, mitigating, or transferring risk. Shouldn't be getting involved necessarily in individual risk decisions, but in terms of making those decisions, the board should be setting clearly parameters for doing it. There may be specific plans associated with each approach. So the decision might be that where a risk is going to trigger a potential impact of greater than $1 million, then the step will be always a combination of reducing the likelihood, but also reducing the impact by buying cyber assurance. And so the board should be setting the framework and strategy within which information security management can get on with ensuring that the organization is appropriately protected. The board needs to make sure also the CISOs is reporting at appropriate levels within the organization. Quite often, particularly in corporates and enterprises, CISOs are a bit too far down the organization, so it's difficult for them to get across to top management and the board what the current issues are and what needs to be done with them. And it's really, as I said, dealing with current issues is so much the critical thing. It's no good saying we're completely on top of issues which came up a year ago at the point you're trying to explain to Congress why you just had a major breach. So the kind of questions the board should be asking: how does the board demonstrate its accountability? It should be asking, what are the top risks facing our organization, the top cyber risks facing our organization? And the CISO should be in a position to answer that. Are we conducting regular information security risk assessments? Vast numbers of organizations do no risk assessment at all. So it's a key question for boards. What are we doing? How are we conducting them? Are we testing systems before a problem arises, or are we just waiting for there to be a problem and then trying to fix it afterwards? How do we demonstrate compliance with our security controls? That's an important question. How do we respond if there is a data breach? Have we rehearsed our response plan? Do we know how that's going to actually work? Are we adequately insured? Do we have an effective information security audit? Those are, again, important questions. Do we have a proper budget? Do we know the budget is being spent appropriately? Do we have visibility into the network? Do we have a good working knowledge of what the information security frameworks and standards are in a way that enables us to comply with them? Have we dealt with supplier risk? As an organization grows and it has a more and more established supply chain, so it makes sense to ensure that through that supply chain there's effective information security. You don't want a supplier delivering a PDF version of a manual which also happens to have malware in it, making sure that the building management systems into which your heating and ventilation companies are able to plug, ensuring there's appropriate security through those relationships is critical. When did we last test our recovery procedures? A working principle for any modern information security management system is that you're going to be breached. And if you're going to be breached, then it makes sense to have a working incident response process and to test your recovery procedures so that when you're breached, you can make sure that in reality, you're able to recover quickly. You aren't trying to work out in the middle of dealing with the breach what you're supposed to be doing to recover. So there you have some 12 questions, which are good questions for the board to be asking the CISO and on a regular basis. So organization decides to implement an information security management system. How do you go about doing it? What are the 9 steps? And we broke it down as 9 steps because that's kind of what we found over the many hundreds of information security management systems that we've helped organizations implement, is that they all follow pretty much the same process. And the first step is to have a project mandate. And a project mandate is a pretty standard thing for any organization with a project management structure. If you've got a project management structure, use that, apply it to implementing the ISMS. In the project mandate, you're going to assemble all the information you need to set out how the project's going to be taken forward. You're going to get top-level commitment to the project. You're going to work out how to demonstrate that and link that into the project. And you're going to set information security goals. In particular, you're going to make sure that your information security goals are clearly linked to business objectives. So you might say, for instance, an information security goal is to ensure that we maintain PCI compliance. And the business goal that's linked to is because we want to increase website e-commerce transactions by 10% in the next period. And being able to demonstrate PCI compliance is a key part of being able to demonstrate to customers that transacting on our website is safe. So link information security goals to business goals. Having got a project mandate, initiate the project. That means setting up a project team. Typically, you're going to assemble a project team from across the business. So you'd be looking to draw in people from most of the departments. You're going to look to draw people from different levels inside the organization, a few senior managers, a few middle managers, a few juniors, because you want to get the best mix of people inside the organization so they can have the most immediate hands-on input into decisions the project team's going to make. You might also want at this point to think about appointing champions, information security management champions in different departments or divisions of the organization, who can be a part of an extended project team, but particularly means they can talk to, teach, share, and then feedback everything that's going on in the information security management project. Having got a team set up and built some internal communications, then it's worth starting the project itself off, the information security management system, by beginning to create documentation. So in order to complete documentation, you need to work out how you're going to do documentation. We call that a documentation structure. And that means thinking about what a policy is going to look like, what will be procedures. A policy, for instance, is a document that sets the direction and intent of an organization. A procedure would set out who does what, where, how, and what, where, who does what, where, how, and when, and in terms of delivering on the policy. And that might be supported by working instructions, which set out the detail of how the how is executed. So work out what your documentation structure is, work out if your documentation is going to integrate with other parts of the business. Is your internal audit going to integrate with the existing financial internal audit or an existing management system audit? That's part of establishing the documentation structure. The stage after that is to create a management framework. Remember, I talked about creating an ISMS as being a something which requires board and top management buy-in, well, your management framework is, to a very real extent, how that buy-in is demonstrated. So you're going to start off with step 4 by identifying the scope of the information security management system. You're going to look at the scope in terms of what's under control of management and what's not. You're going to look at handoffs between what, as an organization, you control and services perhaps you buy in from third parties, but you can't actually control the services. So compliance, the boundary of control, you'll be looking at interfaces and dependencies to establish exactly where your boundary of control is. So you've got the scope of the information security management system. Typically, that's the whole of an organization. And for that entity, you then formalize an information security policy. Remember, a policy is a high-level document, so it's going to be setting out management intent. It'll link to the business goals. It'll set one or more very specific information security goals, and we'll talk about issues like management, about disciplinary policy, and some of the key areas that you'll want the organization generally to understand is an important part of how you're addressing information security. So policy is at the heart of your ISMS. You need then to communicate it. So when setting up the management framework is a good time to define the communication strategy, work out who's going to own communication, what you're going to be talking about at different points in the project itself, and identify the competence requirements. It's an expectation of any management system standard that work will be carried out by people competent to carry out that work. And that means you need to think about the extent to which the staff you've got have got appropriate skills and qualifications. Are you looking for qualification by experience, or are you looking for qualification by having done a series of training courses and exams? But you need to decide that yourself. And you then need, having arrived at an appropriate set of determinations around what competence looks like, ensure that the staff you employ to do those jobs have the competences you've determined. Step 5 is then to determine baseline security criteria. And baseline security criteria really are those information security controls that you have to put in place in order to meet your existing business and regulatory compliance requirements. So if you're a organization processing payment cards, for instance, it's a contractual requirement to implement PCI DSS. So one of your baseline security criteria is PCI DSS, and baseline security controls therefore will include all of the controls mandated for your particular self-assessment questionnaire for PCI. There may be other practices you have in place or other laws that you're mandated to comply with, and therefore controls which you put in place. And so you identify those, look at the controls you already have in place, and build into that set of baseline controls the additional ones you've identified, and you make sure those are complete. You ensure they're effective, work out how you're going to measure their effectiveness, tying that back to the information security and business goals, and make sure that the controls continue to be effective in terms of achieving their objectives. At this point, you can carry out a risk management, a risk assessment. You move into the risk assessment part of the program. So you need a methodology, you need a risk assessment tool, you need to define risk acceptance criteria, and you need out of that to create a statement of applicability. And essentially what you're doing with a risk assessment is determining for each of the assets that's within the scope of the management system what threats there are that might exploit specific vulnerabilities, and the likelihood of that happening, of a threat exploiting a vulnerability, and the impact on the organization if it does so successfully. And it's that assessment that enables you to determine what controls it's appropriate to have in place. And the statement of applicability is simply a list of controls. And for ISO 27001, you take the list of controls which is included in Annex A. There's about 114 controls there, and you'd identify which of them you've applied and identify the reason why you selected it, as well as identifying for those controls you've not selected the reason why you've not selected them. Now, the point about doing that is really you can think of it as a matter of completeness, providing some basic information to third parties, but it's not like telling the bad guys what you do, because identifying that you've selected access control on Annex A doesn't give the bad guys any idea of how you've deployed access control. That, of course, you would expect to remain confidential. So having selected a set of controls, you need to implement them. And that's going to depend on where the controls currently operate. You're going to roll them out on the basis of where they're going to be most effective. And certainly part of that is going to be staff awareness, ensuring that staff are properly aware of their role in preventing and dealing with risks. A management system is meant to be living. I said that it should be continually improved. And so the 8th step is to measure, monitor, and review your management system. And that's about having an internal audit program, monitoring the effectiveness of controls, measuring how well they work, analyzing the way in which threats are evaluated, and making sure that the outcomes of all of that are reviewed by management on at least an annual basis, or when there are major changes in the organization, to ensure that you're learning from experience. So continual improvement is one of the big benefits of an information security management system. It gives you a systematic and structured approach to continual improvement. And then the 9th step would be certification. Certification is the independent attestation that your management system is in line with the international standard, and that's going to be a combination of reviewing your documentation, making sure it's complete and meets the requirements of the standard. It will be a look at the records of internal audits and testing, as well as of management review, and it will be an actual review in the form of, so your policy says that you do a risk assessment like this, can you show me how you actually do it? And the auditor would expect to see that you're doing what your management system says you are doing. So certification is the 9th step in the process. Let me just talk a bit more about risk assessments and controls. The information security risk assessment really is the core of the ISMS, and the risk assessment should be repeatable, should be transparent, and should give consistent results. There are 5 steps to carrying out a successful risk assessment. The first is to create a risk management framework, then to identify the risks, to analyze them, to evaluate them, and then to select the risk treatment options. And risk treatment options are the 4 standard options: to avoid the risk, to modify it by applying a control, to share the risk with a third party through insurance, or to retain the risk. In other words, to do nothing about it, just to put up with it. And risk assessment from an ISO 27001 perspective is a top-down, management-driven process, and it should mean that 2 organizations who have similar size and structure in the same industry could make different decisions about which controls to apply, because the risk appetite of management in each business is different, and risk appetite is the basis on which the organization is going to make decisions about controls. So the risk assessment process is going to determine the controls. The 114 controls in Annex A, as I've mentioned, are designed to mitigate information security risks. While you can select controls from elsewhere, Annex A is a pretty comprehensive set, and most organizations find that they can work perfectly adequately with that. You don't have to use your own control set. You don't have to use Annex A. You simply have to use a set of controls. And whichever set of controls you use has to be mapped to Annex A in the statement of applicability, and has to be linked to a risk treatment plan, which sets out how you're going to go about implementing the controls that you have selected. And just a brief look at the controls in Annex A. They start with information security policies. A5 is the first set of controls, because the first paragraph in the parallel standard ISO 27002, which talks about how to implement controls, is paragraph 5 that deals with information security policies. So there is a one-to-one read across from the Annex A controls to ISO 27002. A6 deals with the organization of information security and sets out controls around how you might do that effectively. So it deals with roles, the idea of roles and responsibilities, with having pre-planned relationships with regulatory and security authorities that you know who to talk to, and other specialist entities. So it's about organizing information security properly. A7 is dealing with security and HR, and looks at security before, during, and after employment, with ideas like pre-employment checks, clarity about job descriptions, and then effective termination, which ensures that people don't continue to have access to the system and its data. Asset management, most information security management systems are built around protecting information assets. That means you need to know what they are. And A8 talks about how to identify different assets, how to approach them, looks at the relationships between them. And A9 then talks about how to control access to those assets. And it recognizes that access control starts at a physical or a perimeter level, and there might be different levels of access control all the way into perhaps even access limited at the level of an individual cell in a spreadsheet or an individual element of data. A10 deals with cryptography. Under GDPR, for instance, it's recognized that if data is encrypted and there is a data breach, there is no risk to rights and freedoms of data subjects, such that it's not necessary to report the breach to a regulator. Physical and environmental security is dealing with exactly that, making sure that server centers and the physical means by which data is processed or shared are themselves appropriately secure, that there are proper mechanisms in place to deal with the possibility of environmental threat of physical or building collapse. A12 and A13 typically go together. They tend to be the preserve of the head of IT or the IT manager. Operations security is looking at the range of controls around how IT services are operated, and A13 is dealing with telecoms and comms security. A14 therefore starts looking at how an organization goes about acquiring, deploying, and maintaining its systems. And the driving logic here is that information security should be built into the system acquisition process rather than bolted on later on. I touched earlier on supplier relationships. A15, in fact, is a set of controls that you can apply in a supply chain. It starts with having a policy around supply chain security and then looks at a number of elements inside the supply chain, including telecoms and hardware security. A16 turns to incident management, recognizing that having a tried and tested method of responding to information security incidents is pretty smart. You don't want to be trying to deal with the ramifications of a potential ransomware attack while in the middle of it. It makes sense for people to know how to report stuff, for you to know how to deal with it, and to be well practiced and versed in dealing with incidents. A17 is about how you link your ISMS into a business continuity management system, and it talks also about making sure that the information security aspects of business continuity are dealt with. So typically business continuity plans have calling trees or copies of plans on USB sticks. The USB sticks themselves need to be kept secure. They contain personal and other confidential information. So A17 is looking at how, when you're integrating business continuity and information security, you can make sure that they work effectively together. Finally, A18 is dealing with compliance, and compliance is in a sense where we started looking at ISO 27001. Here it's listing all of the, asking you to list all of the regulations with which you might have to comply and identify the way in which your ISMS enables you to meet those compliance requirements. It also touches on internal audit. So it's a very comprehensive set of controls, as you can see, provides most organizations with what they need to be able to put in place effective information security. So let's talk about documentation and testing the ISMS. The next stage, you want to make sure that the ISMS is properly documented. We talked earlier on about one of the steps as being to create a structure for or a framework for documentation, and the idea of different types of level of documentation depending on whether it's policy or procedure. And you can therefore have different levels of role inside the organization signing off on those documents. You can simply have the board signing off on a policy, but you could then have the line managers or executives signing off on procedures and work instructions. And that makes it easy for a management system to be kept up to date. You can have templates for different types of information. You certainly need to determine very clearly roles and responsibilities. Typically, an organization will create a RACI metrics, which sets out for each process and each element in a process who has to be responsible, accountable, and who has to be consulted and or informed. You also want to create a process in putting your documentation framework in place that ensures you can track revisions, how documents are approved, where requirements are set out in documents, and what the arrangements are for meeting those requirements. So standard formulas for documents and standard process for revisions and approvals to documents. Documents have to be maintained, the business changes, the way you work a process changes, and the ISMS and ISO 27001 recognizes that. And one of the roles of internal audit is to identify where processes have diverged from what the documents say should happen. Internal audit's job is to identify the divergence. That puts management in a position to decide whether the divergence is the right thing, in which case it's going to change the documentation, or it's the wrong thing, in which case it's going to re-educate the staff concerned. So internal audit is checking that the way in which people are behaving conforms to the requirements of the management system, the documented ISMS processes, and is also therefore making sure that the documentation conforms to the requirements of ISO 27001. So as you can see, internal audit is a very important part of having an effective information security management system. Lastly, there's certification audits. I talked briefly about the benefits to the organization of a certification audit. It requires an external review by a certifying body. Typically, a certifying body is one which does not itself deliver the consultancy on how to become certified. They will send an auditor who will carry out an audit of your information security management system, look at all the ways in which it complies with the requirements of ISO 27001, and assuming that that audit is successful and they don't identify any non-conformances, that will result in the certification body issuing a certificate, and the certificate will detail the scope of the information security management system and will reference the statement of applicability. For an organization pursuing ISO 27001 for the first time, the whole process of auditing can seem pretty intrusive and worrying. The reality is that over time you get used to it. It becomes just a standard part of how the organization operates, a standard part of how the management give themselves satisfaction that the organization is behaving in a way that is appropriate to its business objectives and its compliance requirements. So summarizing up then, the benefits of obtaining independent assurance, and there are in the United States independent registrars or certification bodies like DNV, SGS, BVI, BSI, Perry Johnson, and others, all of which are either US-wide or and have capability to deliver certifications right across the states, or might be part of global organizations, so can provide support globally. So independent assurance should enable you to win new business, to retain existing customers, should obviously help you avoid financial loss and penalties that come from a compliance breach. Deployed effectively should help you protect, enhance your reputation, help you comply with business, legal, contractual, and regulatory requirements, because you're able to pull them all together into a single framework. And if you're able to demonstrate compliance with a single framework through a single integrated audit program, that should mean that you can reduce the kind of silo-based approach to audits which comes from tackling compliance on a regulation by regulation basis. And from a management point of view, of course, it gives an independent assurance that the organization's selection of controls are working as intended, and that the chances of the CEO having to go down to Congress to explain why information security was so inadequate is properly under control. So there's a bunch of things which as a company we do to help organizations who want to address ISO 27001. You can buy a copy of the standard, this link, and we'll send the slides out to everybody on the webinar afterwards. This link will take you to where you can buy ISO 27001 from our website. We're an approved distributor for the standards bodies. There are books like 9 Steps for Success and the first book I wrote, which is primarily around information security controls. There are training courses delivered in New York and Boston, and also online across the whole of the US. There are policies and documentation toolkits which enable you to deal with ISO 27001, but also NYDFS that are capable of patching into a number of state data breach laws. There's a gap analysis consultancy which we can deliver in person or across the internet. There's risk assessment software. So there's a very comprehensive suite of services, including obviously consultancy and, as I said, training. So we have a foundation, a lead implementer training course, and then a packaged product, a foundation and lead implementer training course. And given that we've just opened our first office in New York, we're currently offering the combination course for anybody. When you book that course, you'll get a free ISO 27001 cybersecurity documentation toolkit at the point that you book that course. So it's a special celebrate our opening of the office in New York offer. Take advantage of it on our website now. And our website is itgovernanceUSA.com. You can email us, you can call us toll free, and there's the whole range of social media routes by which you can make contact with us. So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings me to the end of what I was planning to say. I'm going to deal with questions now. So if you haven't and you've got questions, please use the question function. It's in your GoToWebinar panel. If you go into it, you can type any question that you've got in there, and I will answer the questions. I'll read the question out to everybody, and then I'll answer the question. So the first question I've got here is, does ISO 27001 demonstrate compliance with NYDFS? And the answer is, it's a way in which you can demonstrate you've gone about complying with the cybersecurity requirements of NYDFS, and that you've been audited to do so. It won't conclusively prove that you are in compliance, because that will come down to a regulatory judgment, but it should put you in a position where the demonstration of all the cybersecurity compliance components is such that you can avoid any of the more complex compliance options that might come up. Is penetration testing a requirement of ISO 27001? No is the answer to that question. It's not a requirement of ISO 27001. If you remember, ISO 27001 says that you must select controls on the basis of the organization's risk assessment. And there are many organizations for which a risk assessment would not identify penetration testing. You don't have websites, you've got limited online connectivity. Penetration testing would be not important, but there are many others for which it would. And so the answer is ISO 27001 mandates doing a risk assessment, and a risk assessment might lead you to select a penetration test as a relevant control. And ladies and gentlemen, that looks like it's only 2 questions tonight. So if there are any others, now's the time to pose them. But if not, I will wish you all a very good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on this webinar. Do go onto our website if there are more resources, information we can provide you with, and I hope that you have a very good 1st of March afternoon. Bye-bye.